Hello and welcome to another episode of Agency Leadership Live. I'm your host, Chip Griffin. You can read that right here on the screen below me, just in case you didn't know. I am grateful that you decided to tune in today. It is, of course, Friday. It's July 31st, 2020, or if you prefer, March 149th, 2020. However you prefer to think of it. But since it's Friday, that means it is Q&A day. I dip into the mailbag, I look at some of the recent coaching calls I've had with agency owners, and of course, I take your questions live during this session. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to ask them in the comments in the live chat, and I will try to answer them as we go along here today. Of course, you can always find the latest episodes at agencyleadership.tv, both pre-recorded and the live stream recordings themselves. And if you'd like some additional resources, just go over to the Agency Leadership website, agencyleadership.com/join. We'll take you to the sign-up form for our free Agency Leadership Council, where you have access to the Slack community and additional downloadable resources and templates. So, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's show. All right, so I guess we'll get started with the mailbag today. So let's go ahead and we're going to bring up one of the questions that I got asked in a recent coaching session just a couple of days ago. I was speaking with an agency owner who asked about projects that frequently change in scope and how to handle that when you're halfway through the project and you realize that there's something else that you should be doing for the client, or sort of like when you're building a house, if you realize that as long as you're in here, you might as well do this or that. And this is something that's very common for all kinds of agencies. And one of the things this agency owner said to me was that they had had an internal brainstorming session on the topic. And one of his employees said, you know, we really ought to think about having the client pay us to do some strategy first, a small project that will then allow us to do a better job of scoping. And I said to him, you need to give that employee a medal, because that is exactly the best approach here to deal with these kinds of situations. It is the ideal scenario that you have managed to do what is known as paid discovery. And of course, you wouldn't typically call it that to the client. You would instead describe it as an initial strategy session, an audit, a planning program, whatever you want to describe it as. It's an opportunity when you are an agency starting to build a relationship with a new client that you don't know particularly well. You can sell them this smaller, less risky for both sides type of project. You can get in there, you can work with them to figure out what do they really need? What are they really trying to achieve? Because we all know in the agency world that we have prospects who come to us and say, I need a website, I need a media strategy, I need a Facebook strategy. They tend to speak in very tactical terms, when the reality is they're looking to accomplish something much bigger picture. And so your challenge in selling your services is to get that prospect to reveal to you what they're really trying to do, how they will measure the success of your engagement. And oftentimes it's difficult to do that during a normal prospecting conversation. You're typically in a stronger place if you're able to sell them that initial strategy or audit type program where you go in, you spend some time with the client, and you start to learn a whole lot more about what they're doing. You learn about the tools that they're using, you learn about what metrics they are already tracking, you learn about their business to see what's working and what isn't. And as you build this base of knowledge, you can then tap into your own expertise and experience to figure out how best to plug in the services that you provide in order to continue the work with that client into the future in a way that is mutually beneficial and successful. So paid discovery is a tremendous way to do this. And particularly these days where everybody's being very cautious with their budgets, most folks don't want to commit to large engagements with their agencies right off the bat, particularly if it's an agency that they don't know much about, that you've just started to get to know. And so giving them something like that that's less risky, it's less expensive, it's short duration, that's the kind of thing that a lot of times makes it easier to make that initial sale. But the benefits aren't just that you can scope your services better. It's not just that it makes it an easier sale because it's a less risky transaction. You also will learn a lot during these paid discovery sessions. You start to understand if this is a client that you really want to work with. You get to figure out if there really is chemistry between your two teams. You get to understand if what you do can really help them. Because one of the worst scenarios you can be in is that you've sold a solution based on a handful of preliminary conversations during the sales stage, only to realize in the middle of the project that what you're doing really isn't going to deliver the benefit that they need. And it's very difficult until you get to know a client well exactly which levers to pull. But you also learn about that client. How do they operate with you as an agency? And this will help you with your pricing going forward too. So if the client is very difficult to work with and asks for a lot of changes and is late to meetings and constantly reschedules and does other things that gum up the works to make your job as an agency less efficient, you can price that in. If you get the sense that these are folks who are going to be very picky about every little detail and constantly wanting changes, you can price that in. On the other hand, if you start to work with them and realize that they're pretty easy to work with, that there is that kind of connection, then you can take that into account when you're doing your pricing, and maybe you don't need to leave quite as much of a cushion as you otherwise would. And that takes us to the next piece of this, how you handle scope creep and scope changes that take place. Regardless of whether you've been able to successfully sell a paid discovery session, there's still the chance that you're going to have scenarios where the scope changes, either because you realize that it should change or because the client comes to you and asks for some sort of change. And so you want to be thinking about how do you protect yourself as a business in that scenario. And one of the ways that you can do it is by being very clear in your initial scope of work what is, and importantly, is not included. And you'll know from your experience having worked on other projects, what are the kinds of things that are likely to throw a wrench into the mix? Is it the number of revisions that someone asks for? Is it the timing of turnaround on things? Is it there are all sorts of different things that you can look at to figure out how you want to manage that scope of work to control your scope creep so that at least you can go back to that document and say to the client, that was not included in our original price, so we can do it for you, but we're going to need to figure out a different way of managing it, and you may have to pay more. Or perhaps we can take something out that was in the original scope and swap it. So the client's costs may not be changing, but the scope of work would, so you're not delivering on something that you had otherwise promised to do. It gives you that leverage in the conversation to manage the relationship a little bit more effectively. The other thing that you should be doing, again, regardless of whether you have paid discovery, is you should be building in a cushion, particularly for long-term projects where it's like building a house and you have those things where once you open up the walls, you realize that you probably should replace the wiring at the same time that you're in there. You're going to be having those things whether you're a public relations agency building a media campaign and realizing that perhaps there's some work that needs to be done on talking points or messaging that you didn't realize was needed, or if you're building a website and you realize that there's some functionality you should add in, or you're running an ad campaign and you realize that there's some additional research that was needed. Inevitably, anytime you're working on a large-scale project or a long-term relationship with a client, these things are going to come up. And so you never want to come up with bare bones pricing that doesn't include some sort of cushion to allow you to absorb some of that work without having to nitpick with the client every little detail of something that might technically be out of scope. Because the more that you're doing that, the more difficult and contentious you're making the relationship. So it's always a balancing act. You don't want to be taken advantage of by the client, but you also don't want to be in a position where you're always playing bad cop. And I sort of think about this in the same way that I do being a baseball umpire or a basketball referee. One of the things that we always do when we're training new officials is that they need to figure out how to work with coaches, to work with players so that they allow the things to go that they need to let go, but they don't allow themselves to be walked all over. And if you've got a coach who's yapping in your ear about something, you don't want to be, always responding to them, but at the same time, at some point, you do have to shut them down and say, that's enough, that's your warning, or you're going to be ejected. And you need to think about client relationships in similar ways. Not that you typically are ejecting clients, although I've talked many times about the importance of being willing to fire clients who are difficult or abusive or unprofitable. But really, it's just a concept of trying to keep your projects within scope and making sure that you don't simply overservice and say yes every time the client asks for something. Now, finally, the other thing that you need to think about when you're looking at these situations where you've got scope creep or the possibility of scope creep, or you get in there and you realize that there's something else that needs to be done, you don't always have to frame it as something that's done in the context of the current project or even the current retainer if that's how you're working with a client. Instead, you can think about things where you have something additional that you can sell to the client. So if you're working on some aspect of their business and you're helping them out with that and you spot something else that you do well, that they would be wise to take advantage of, maybe propose it as the next phase. So go to the client and say, once we finish this, we think this other thing might be the next best step for you, and sell them on the benefits of that. So instead of feeling like you need to take care of everything all within that original project, look at it as something where you can work in stages and phases. And frankly, that's really important these days anyway, whether you're working on retainers or projects. You want to break things into manageable chunks so that clients are consistently seeing progress. They're seeing you deliver things to them that they're looking for, and they're starting to get results from them. Gone are the days where, as agencies, we could sit on something and take 3 or 4 or 5 months to put together the perfect website or the perfect media campaign or whatever. We need to find ways to help get those quicker victories for clients because everybody is in that mindset of wanting to see results now, particularly right now where everybody's just struggling with what's going on. They're either drinking out of a fire hose or they're trying to figure out how to recover. And so you want to be in a position where you're looking to help your clients on those things. And instead of looking at these scope changes and scope creep as a negative, look at them as opportunities for new sales and growth with that particular client. So hopefully that gives you some tools to handle some of these issues as they come up. So with that, we'll move on to the second question today. Let's go ahead and bring that up here on screen. And this is a question that I got from someone in my network who says, I just got laid off and I'm thinking about starting an agency. What kind of agency should I start? And so, look, there are unfortunately a lot of folks in the PR, marketing, and digital spaces, more so on the PR and marketing side, who are finding themselves out of work right now. We've heard a steady drumbeat, particularly of some of the larger agencies, letting really talented people go, really senior people who are adding value, but unfortunately, because of the significant economic damage that has taken place, these agencies simply can't afford the headcount that they had before. And so inevitably, a lot of folks in this position will think about starting an agency. They may start out as doing some freelance consulting and then move to the agency concept from there, or like this individual, they may already be thinking about it. And typically that's because they had in the back of their minds maybe, a year or two ago or more that they might someday like to have their own agency. And so this now is a time when they're looking at it as an opportunity to make lemonade out of lemons. You can't go the other way around, at least as far as I know. If you figure out how to make lemons out of lemonade, do let me know. That would be certainly a very interesting story. But in any case, and frankly, that's how a lot of agencies start. They start when people are between jobs for whatever reason. In fact, that's how I started my first agency back in the 1990s. I was between gigs because I had finished doing some consulting work related to some congressional elections, and then I was looking to move from Washington, D.C. to New Hampshire. And so like any good unemployed political type, I said, you know what? I'm just a consultant. I'm not unemployed. And so fortunately, I was able to start getting some contracts even before I had made the move, and I was able to grow that into a real agency business. It wasn't something that I had really planned out all that well. I mean, in the back of my mind, I had thought since I was a kid that one day I would like to own my own business, and certainly as I continued my time in Washington in the 90s, I did think about starting a consulting firm or agency of some sort. So it wasn't totally foreign to me, but I can't say that I went into it with any grand plan. It was really just as simple as not wanting to describe myself as unemployed and instead have the psychological benefit of calling myself a consultant. And I was fortunate enough that it turned into a real business. And so, regardless of how you're coming at this and whether you are at that point where you've been laid off and you're thinking about starting an agency, or maybe frankly you're listening to this because you're still working somewhere but you see opportunity out there, and so perhaps you're thinking about leaving proactively to start your own agency. And that's great. I got to tell you, entrepreneurship's a fantastic thing. I enjoy it. I encourage folks to participate in it. You do have to have the mindset to be a risk taker. You do have to be comfortable with everything that comes along with being a small business owner. But if you're game for it, this is actually not a bad time to be looking at starting an agency. But the original question asked, and I'll bring it back up here so you can see it, what kind of agency should I start? And so I find that to be sort of an interesting question and a perplexing question at the same time. So my first piece of advice here is you don't want to be someone who's going out there and chasing after the end of the rainbow, the latest pot of gold, the hot trend. That's not typically your best way to start any kind of business, but particularly an agency. Instead, what you want to do is, if you're thinking about starting an agency, I would suggest look at your own experiences. Where is your expertise? What kind of clients have you worked with successfully in the past? What industries do you know well? Do you have a reputation already that you can tap into, or are you starting from scratch there? And then overlay that with what you see as needs in the marketplace. So you don't want to be simply thinking about, who needs the help right now. And one of the mistakes that I see a lot of new agency owners make is that they tend to think small. And so even if someone has experience in working for larger companies and bigger challenges, a lot of times when they go out on their own, they will start to think about what small businesses can they serve. And they do it for a couple of reasons. The first is that there's this perception that selling to small businesses is easier, and so there's more of them, and so it's an easier way to get some traction. The second is the thought that the big guys don't want to be hiring an upstart new agency, solo practitioner who's just looking to build a team. They want to work with larger, more established firms. And so that sort of small ball mentality, I think, immediately shows up for a lot of new agencies. And look, if your background is in working with those kinds of smaller businesses, it can be a great place to work because you know that space. But if you've got most of your career experience doing communications and marketing for Fortune 100 companies, trying to take that and immediately apply it to small businesses is going to be a challenge. The problems that they have are not the same. The budgets that they have are not the same. Now, I will say it is oftentimes easier to sell to a small business because typically you're dealing directly with the owner. So you're not dealing with committees and layers of approvals and RFPs and all of those kinds of things that can get in the way in the larger businesses. But you're also dealing with much smaller dollar amounts for the work that you're doing. So don't look at small as your solution. Also, don't look at simply what's needed in the marketplace as your primary indicator of what space to choose or what services to go after. As I've said repeatedly on this show and other podcasts, you need to have an appreciation, if not a passion, for the work that you're doing. And so if you decide that, right now the folks who need the help most are, I don't know, testing companies or hospitals or something like that, but it's not an area that you have an interest in, it's going to be very difficult for you, particularly in those early stages where, in the early stages of any business, but particularly an agency, you're not managing the business, you're not running the business, you're in there doing everything. You're the marketer, you're the salesperson, you're the client delivery person, you are the bookkeeper, you're doing it all. And if you're not working with clients that you enjoy working with, it's going to be very difficult to motivate yourself every day to do your best. So you need to make sure that what you're looking at is that Venn diagram that I talk about all the time of looking for that sweet spot between the clients who will pay you to do something, the things that you're good at, and the things that you enjoy, and the type of clients that you enjoy. And where you find those three things intersecting, that's where you're likely to have the most success. So hopefully that gives you some food for thought for anyone who is thinking about starting an agency right now, or frankly, even if you've already got an agency and you're just thinking about making some adjustments in what you're doing, who you're servicing, and all that. So, all right, so let's go ahead and we will bring up the next question that we have from the slide. And again, if you have questions in real time, feel free to share them in chat. I'll be happy to try to get to them. So here we go. So this one is, when should I hire a director of operations or other similar role? And so this is a good question. Let me just take a quick sip of water here. Every so often you got to do that. So if you are in a position where your agency is growing, you've got a lot of client activity that's going on, and in this particular case, this was someone who felt that the team wasn't being as efficient as possible. They were perhaps lacking in some guidance, and the business had grown large enough that the owner wasn't able to devote the amount of attention that was really needed to keep the team focused. And there's no simple answer when you need to hire a director of operations or a traffic manager or a project manager, or those kinds of roles that are sort of making sure that all of the trains are running on time and the resources are properly allocated and all that. But you need to start by looking at what your pain points are. And this is true for all hiring in your agency. You need to look at what you're good at. You need to look at what you struggle with. You need to look at the areas that your business likely needs help in. And some of this requires you to step back and sort of try to take as objective a look as you possibly can as an owner at the way that your business is functioning. And it is one of those places where it can be beneficial to have some sort of an external sounding board, whether that's a coach and advisor, or whether it's an informal advisory group, or whether it's just simply another agency owner or entrepreneur that you can bounce things around with. And as you look at that, you'll start to figure out, where are those gaps? Where do you need the help? And if you're in a situation like this owner was, where you've got the team and they're maybe not feeling like there's enough guidance, and it's either not what you enjoy doing or you realize you're not good at it. I mean, we all know to some degree what our own strengths and weaknesses are. There are some of us who are really good at making the trains run on time. There are some of us who are really good at coming up with the big creative ideas that push the envelope. There are some folks who love doing sales. Whatever it is, you need to understand where you need that help. And it's an expense that's very difficult to take on when you're particularly small. So bringing on someone who is just your traffic manager or project manager for your agency is going to be very difficult when you're in the single digits number of employees. Typically in those cases, if the owner is not the one who's playing that role, then you would typically look at having one of the account managers or an existing employee take that on as one of their responsibilities, because frankly, when you're, say, 10 employees or less, you may not need as much of that. As you start moving into double digits, that's where you start thinking about, should I have someone who is filling that role on a more or less full-time basis? Is it really needed? Are you budgeting for it? I mean, one of the things you need to be careful of here is, if you're adding in this layer of project management, you need to be accounting for that cost and the work that they're doing when you're looking at project budgets, which help you do proper pricing, which then delivers you proper profitability. So think about those things. Think about the kind of person that you need here too. So it's not just a question of, do I hire a director of operations, project manager, traffic manager? It's, if I do, what kind would I be hiring? Am I looking for someone who is modestly experienced, knows a bit about the industry, but isn't too expensive and can sort of grow into the role? Or am I looking for someone who has already been filling this role somewhere else? The price points for those are going to be very different. What you get from them is going to be very different. And there are pros and cons to both, not just from a cost perspective, but someone who's already been doing this in another agency comes with preconceived notions and they have a system that's likely worked for them before. So if you're going to bring them in, you need to make sure that there's alignment in how they see things and the way you see things. If you bring in someone greener, yes, they'll take more time to get up to speed and you'll have to spend more time working with them, but you can also mold them into the system that you want to have in your agency as far as how you allocate resources and run projects. So there's a whole bunch of things that go into this planning process, and you need to think very carefully about when you pull the trigger on this kind of position. But if you're in a situation where you feel like you're not getting the level of profitability that you need, and if you're doing proper reporting and you're looking at your project budgets and you're managing all of that, you'll start to see very quickly where your gaps are, where your holes are, where your money sinks are. And that will help indicate to you when it's time to hire someone to be your operations and project person to drive the path forward. So, all right, that will cover that question. Let's go ahead and we will bring up, we've got time for at least one more, maybe two more here in the mailbag. So we'll bring this next one up. And this is, should I be running Google Ads for my agency? So as agencies, we're constantly thinking about how we can communicate and market on behalf of our clients. Most agencies do a very poor job of looking inward and figuring out how to tell their own story, how to market their own agency, and to demonstrate their own expertise to a broader market in order to help grow the business and take the agency where the owner wants to go. And so this is something that we all need to be mindful of. And while this particular question was very much zeroed in on Google Ads, I want to take it up to a little bit of higher level first and say, I think one of the things that you need to be doing as an agency, whether you are a solo agency owner just looking to get started, or whether you're a more established agency, you need to set up your own agency as a client of itself. And this isn't always easy, and it's always the thing that falls through the cracks first. As soon as you get busy on client work, you discard it. But you need to set aside time, your own time as an agency leader and your team's time as you grow, to focus on the activities that you can undertake to help grow your agency's profile and to help demonstrate its place in the marketplace. And so if you're doing that, that means that you're putting together a proper plan of some sort. And it can be a plan just on the back of a note card for all I care. It doesn't need to be super intensively detailed, but it does need to be clear. And you need to figure out what are the main things that you want to work on as an agency. And we all have to remember that most agencies don't need that many new clients on an annual basis to really succeed and to have considerable growth. It's a handful of clients, new clients every year, that most agencies need to see that level of success. 5, maybe 10, depending on the types of work that you do and the size of your engagements. But if that's what you're looking for, you then need to figure out what are the tactics that you're going to use to get there. And I know a lot of you are building funnels for clients and doing large-scale marketing campaigns, and you need to be careful that you're not putting yourself in that same mindset, because you don't need, nor could you even handle, the lead flow that you may be generating for your clients. It's not the kind of thing where you can simply replicate that for yourself. And in some cases, depending on what your own specialty is as an agency, you may actually be better off hiring another agency that does specialize in that kind of work. There are plenty of agencies that specialize in working for professional services firms and folks like you to help them get their message out and generate the leads that they need. So if you don't really feel like you can handle it yourself, think about that route. But then you need to say, okay, what are my top priorities? How do I want to invest my time, and how do I want to invest whatever budget that I have? And so that draws us back to that original question that I was asked about, should I buy Google Ads for my agency? And so you need to look and say to yourself, if I were going to invest in Google Ads, what will they cost? And Google is great. They have a keyword planner tool that will give you a good sense as to the volume and the cost of various search terms. So you should start by looking at the kinds of things that you think your prospects might be putting into Google so that you can understand, what's the scope here? If you're looking for something where, let's say you're a very geographically focused agency and your specialty is working within a very narrow market, let's say the New Hampshire market, then you might do really well to be purchasing terms either geographically targeted alone or with geography in the actual search term or both that will help you do things. So for example, if you were in New Hampshire, you might look for search terms like New Hampshire marketing agency, New Hampshire PR agency, New Hampshire digital agency. You might look for those kinds of things. You might apply some geographic restrictions and just get a sense as to what kind of cost you're looking at and is there traffic to even justify. Now you also have to look at the organic search results that are already there. Are you even showing up for these search terms? If not, why not? Is it really the kind of thing that people would be typing in to look for you? Is it that you need to make some adjustments to your website? There may be some low or no cost things that you can do to your website to make it more findable for your ideal prospects without even having to look to the Google AdWords side of things. So you need to think about how you're investing your time. You need to think about how you're positioned. The more narrowly you are positioned, the more niched you are, the more likely you are to be able to use some of these search terms effectively. If I consider myself a full-service marketing agency that serves just about any industry, it's going to be much more difficult and much more expensive, frankly, to generate the leads that I want in all likelihood using something like Google Ads. And so I might want to be thinking about something more targeted. And you need to think again about your prospect. What are they actually going to be looking for? And one of the things that we found in I didn't find it, but it was some research that came out last year from RFP Associates and a couple of other groups that teamed together to do some research. They found that most clients who were looking for agencies did so by tapping into their own Rolodex and asking perhaps their own networks, and a lot didn't do a lot of proactive searching. So ask yourself, how did your current clients find you? How do you think that folks like them might find you in the future? Because if you're investing in ads, whether they're on Google or Facebook or other places, that may be misplaced revenue plus misplaced time resources if it doesn't fit in with the way that your prospects are likely to show up. So bottom line is this needs to be part of an overarching sales and marketing campaign for your agency, and you really shouldn't be making these decisions as simply one-offs without looking at that bigger picture. So hopefully that helps any of you who are considering going that route. And you know what, we're going to squeeze one more question here before we're out of time. And so we'll bring that one up here on the screen. Why do you spend so much time doing podcasts, videos, etc.? This is one that I narrowed down a little bit. It was someone I was talking to, someone I've known well, and they said, we're seeing you all over the place. You've got a couple of podcasts, you've got these live streams, you're doing pre-recorded videos, you've got articles, you're just putting out so much content. How do you do it? Why do you do it? And I think the emphasis really was on the why, which is what I've encapsulated here. And so the reason why I'm covering this here is not so much because I want to talk about myself, but because I can share some of my own experience in doing this sort of activity and the benefit that I see out of it, because I think that what I do is not dissimilar from what you all are doing as agencies and how you're looking to position yourselves. And so I get a lot of value out of all of this content that I'm creating. And obviously, one of the things on that list has to be that it certainly falls into the bucket of content marketing. It's how a lot of us are advising clients in the agency world to be doing things, to really create value and share that. And so that's certainly one of the reasons why I do it. And I have found that anyone who comes to me who has seen one of these videos or listened to one of the podcasts, reading an article too to some degree, but really the audio and video, folks who come to me after having heard those, they tend to be joining me much farther along in the conversation about potentially working with me. Because at that point, once you've seen this, you see how I think, you see how I work, you've heard my voice, you've unfortunately seen my face if you're watching this too. And so it gives you a better perspective And so those conversations that we're having, in many respects, you already feel like you know me. I still need to get to know you, and I would love to get to know you if you're on the listening end here. But it moves that conversation far beyond where you would have a typical initial conversation with any kind of service provider and prospective client. So there's real value in that. But I also do these because it's a great learning opportunity for me. Every time that I answer one of these questions from the mailbag, or I have a guest on my podcast or on my live stream, I'm learning. I'm having to think about what is my perspective on that question if I'm answering a question. I get to dig in and figure out what's working or not working for other agency owners. What's the perspective of other experts who advise agencies? What are all these different pieces of data that I can incorporate that will make me create better content, but more importantly, provide better advice to my clients? Because it's a constant learning process. Whether you are a PR agency veteran who's been in the space for 30 years, or whether you're just getting started, or whether you've been around the block with a bunch of different businesses, you're constantly learning something. And at any point that you feel like you've stopped learning, it's probably a good time to figure out something else to do, because it means that you've probably lost your passion for what you're doing. And I am very passionate about the business of PR and marketing agencies. I love working with agency owners. I love thinking about the challenges that businesses are facing in these times, or any time really. And so all of this content allows me to continue that learning. It allows me to chase different ideas or perspectives. It allows me to dig into research, and it gives me an excuse to spend time on it as opposed to just sitting and reading a book. I can actually turn it into content, and it requires me to think about it more deeply. In fact, I've got this book over here that's on my reading list for this weekend, Financial Intelligence, and it was recommended to me by a viewer of this show, and he said it had made a huge difference in his business. And so I said, well, that's a book I want to read. I had not heard of that particular one, but I love reading books that can help agency owners figure out how to do things better. So I'm going to read that, and then if it turns out to be something that I think there's value in, I'll have a show about it, whether that's on the podcast or here on the video or both, so that I can share that knowledge with other people. So I've managed to enrich myself in that process, and hopefully I'll be able to enrich the experience for some of you also. So content provides those benefits. And of course, the other thing is, anytime you're creating content, it creates an excuse to ask for a conversation. And for many of you, frankly, like myself, you may not be comfortable just reaching out cold to someone and saying, hey, can we just have a conversation? But I find it very easy, and I know many of you who have podcasts find it very easy to reach out to someone and ask them to be a guest. And so it's a very easy way to start to make that connection with someone that you want to get to know better. And whether that's someone who's on your own Nifty 50 list, and I'll include a link to that resource when we post the replay here, but I'm a big fan of Nifty 50 lists as far as using them for targeting people that you want to get to know, people who you can learn from, people who can refer business to you, or even prospective clients. And so if you put together those kinds of things, it's an excuse to have those conversations, whether you're doing a podcast or a video interview series or an article or whatever. So there's huge benefits out of all of this content that I create. Yes, it takes a lot of time, but I love doing it. I love the process of learning how to create the content more effectively. I spent a lot of time over the course of my career doing writing. I started to get into audio back in, I guess it was probably the mid to late 90s when I started creating audio content for websites, and then really jumped full bore into podcasting back in 2006, 2007 when it was just catching fire. So I've been doing that for 15 years now and have had many shows, been guest on many shows. And now more recently getting to dive into video has been just a great learning experience for me. It's been a lot of fun. I love doing this. Hopefully you are getting value out of these sessions as well. And so all sorts of reasons to create the content. You need to figure out what's the best fit for you. You need to figure out how to prioritize your own time and your own needs. But I am certainly a big fan of it, and hopefully you will consider how to mix in more content as far as your way of marketing your business, generating thought leadership, and frankly, learning. So that will bring us to an end of this week's Q&A. If you would like to see a replay of this or any other episode, just go to agencyleadership.tv. And of course, there's also some pre-recorded videos that are good resources, webinars and that kind of stuff that I've done. If you want to get some additional resources, free templates, downloads, project budgeting documents that I talked about, and also to get into our free Slack community, just go to agencyleadership.com/join. And if you've got questions, follow up to this, or you got a question you'd like me to address in next Friday's show, just email me, chip@agencyleadership.com. I love to hear from you, and I love your feedback, even when you give me critical advice like telling me to fix my shirt or things like that that didn't seem to look so good in previous episodes. So with that, I hope you have a fantastic weekend. I hope you do get to take some time off, and wherever you are, hopefully you've got some enjoyable weather to go along with it. And of course, I'm live here Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. If you're on YouTube, be sure to hit the subscribe and the reminder button so that you can get notified as we go live. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, noon Eastern Time. Monday and Wednesday are topic focused, and Friday is this free-for-all Q&A style approach. So have a great weekend. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you all back here next week.